Right, okay, so thanks for still being here. I know how exhausting these events tend to be. So I'm not going to take up more time than I need to, but I've got a kind of a bit more of a formal story about science, technology, and the future, which is from the energy world. So yeah, I hope this is an interesting story, really, for a STIS crowd. So yeah, my name's Mark Winskel. I'm Chancellor's Fellow here at STIS, and I work on energy, climate change research problems with Ronan Bolton and Antti Silvest, who are in the middle of the table there, middle of the room. So this kind of, the work I'm presenting, called Constructing Energy Futures, is some work which developed out of two projects that I was working on. So I'm a contributor to a project which has recently finished, an ESRC project called Heat in the City, which Professor Jan Webb, Dave Hawkey, and others in the sociology bit of STIS have been working on predominantly, but then other people like me and Heather Lovell from Geosciences and Annie Kerr from ECCI. So it's quite a kind of social science interdisciplinary project working on the future of heat in the city, urban scale energy systems. And at the same time, I've been working for something called the UK Energy Research Centre for the last several years, which is a cross-research council, ESRC, PSRC, NERC. So much more kind of the big version of interdisciplinarity across what's sometimes called macro interdisciplinarity, I've heard it called. And across the UK, so working with a wide community of people. And these kind of came together in this piece of work I did, which was to look at changing scenarios of energy futures over the period of time that we've been working on these projects. So there's been some remarkable changes in what we think about the future of energy over that time. And that's just interesting. Why has it changed? What does it change from to? What does it say about how much we can predict the future? It's important because we have this old thing called the Climate Change Act in the UK, which is quite a radical, transformative piece of legislation, which means big changes for all of us, actually. Though we might not all appreciate it, if we're going to meet our targets under this piece of legislation, we have to do very different things with the way we produce and use energy. So it's all kind of targeted to 2050, but in fact, there's a lot of more recent and urgent, pressing, short-term things that are happening, partly because of this act and other things. And the other thing that's been interesting about this problem is that during the course of doing this work, and so over the last sort of 4 years really, there's been an emerging battle of the systems, a new battle of the systems between building level solutions, so more individualistic solutions, and more collective network level solutions. So there's all kinds of nice historical battles of the systems that have been played out in the energy world, going back to the battle between AC and DC in the first time electricity networks were constructed out of cities. And there's something kind of a new emerging battle of the systems happening, so we can make some reference back to those, which I haven't actually done yet in the way I've written this up. So this exists as a book chapter that's being produced by everyone who's been working on Heat in the City. I think that book has just about gone in. I don't think anyone is involved in that book here, but that's just been submitted as a final manuscript to EarthScan. So that's coming out later this year. Anyway, I wanted to use this case study as a way for me to get myself coming back into STIS after a long time working on very applied work based in engineering at Edinburgh for the last 8 years, was to think a bit more conceptually and theoretically about some questions about sort of futurology. So that encompassed things like what does whole systems research actually mean? How do you do it? How do you do this interdisciplinary stuff? It's not easy in practice. Also, this, we really need to think about the future for energy, partly because there's a statutory instrument which forces us to think about the future. But given all these uncertainties, what kind of real role can they have in policy making? Then there's a modeling question, a quantitative data question about how models are very powerful objects in thinking and representing the future in complex socio-technical systems like energy. Then I've gotten a really kind of emerging interest, particularly since I've been back in STIS since last July, about kind of the nature of the research policy system that we're working in, how not only about interdisciplinarity, but how research policy exchange is facilitated. So I've just come from a meeting in town, which unfortunately coincided with the retreat, about kind of getting policymakers and researchers to think about the role of rapid evidence assessment in policymaking, and what is a good problem for rapid evidence assessment, and what is not a very sensible way where rapid evidence assessment isn't an appropriate method to resolve uncertainty. And finally, about really, for me, an important issue about accountable governance and how scenarios might help with us making governance of energy, which is very politically contested and uncertain, a bit more accountable. So that's the outline of the talk, a little bit on introducing scenarios, a bit about the way I divided. So what I essentially did was a review of different versions of the future, and I found it useful to think about that in terms of mainstream accounts and marginal accounts. I'll explain what those were as we go on, and then a few kind of more thematic and conceptual issues to end. So the return of energy futurology. So yeah, there's a whole kind of sorry history of scenarios in energy where people were expecting the world to be very different, our world to be very different than as it's turned out. So energy futurology kind of goes back to the early 70s in many respects, to reactions to the energy crises of that period, sort of the oil crises that happened in the 70s. And there are people still working who were involved in those things, and so a lot of people have a very kind of cautious approach to futurology and energy because of a lot of things, that turned out not to be quite as we firmly assumed they would be or projected them to be. And this also applies to more recent work around climate. There is a whole kind of track record of resources being exhausted, and the collapse of kind of the mature energy infrastructure, which hasn't happened, and so people are very suspicious about what we were saying back in the 70s and the early 80s. So these just a few quotes that help us think about that. If we go back 40 years, so we tend to work towards 2050 because that's the end point of the Committee on the Climate Change Act. So this has become the signal, kind of the point at which we have to sort out our energy system. But if we go back 40 years, it's remarkable just how different the world was. So yeah, when this was written, the oil crisis had never happened. Global warming was a forgotten theory. And then if we think about the 40 year ago kind of assumptions. So, very confident statements were made in 1970 by the system managers, people like Sir Stanley Brown, who was chairman of the CGB. Nuclear energy is the fuel of the future, and fossil fuels will be almost marginal by that time. And of course, what we've seen is an explosion of use of fossil fuels. The dash for gas went in the opposite direction. Nuclear power as a reducing fraction of its contribution in the UK. The last quote is the small print in the Shell scenarios. So the lawyers at Shell are very careful that you don't take their scenarios to have any kind of consequence. So there's always a legal disclaimer to any kind of scenarios which have a corporate imprint on them or ownership. So we're clearly into kind of hazardous territory, but also interesting territory. So I've already said the reason why we're back in a world of futurology for energy is quite an instrumental one in many ways. It's not because we think we have better ways of predicting the future. It's because we have a policy instrument which is expecting us to make a managed transition. So that's why we see a lot of scholarship around transition management applying itself to the energy system. So there's a huge challenge about reconciling the different aspects of energy, which is about affordability, security of supply, and environmental sustainability, that trilemma which we're all familiar with in the energy world. So there's been a lot of exercises in kind of devising scenarios, 2x2 or action spaces and various kind of theoretically driven or less theoretically driven approaches to this. It means that the whole kind of business of futurology and modeling is a great growth industry. If you're in the business of building energy models, there's a huge amount of energy research money coming your way. Well, there's been a massive expansion of research efforts on energy from the research councils and from public-private initiatives. So this is just mapping out, there's two rather similar charts there, which are not very easy to see, but what they are really the expansion of models which address different bits of the energy system, or different types of models. So this one in the corner here is different types of models. Don't really need to know what all those things mean. And the other one is which bit of the energy system they're applying themselves to. But in the period, if anyone was working on energy problems 15 years ago, you could pretty much get away with knowing a couple of models, and a couple of research groups perhaps. So there's clearly a problem of understanding the evidence base. So policymakers there's partly the question about rapid evidence assessments that we've been talking about in town today, and it's because there's a heck of a lot of evidence being produced these days. Which all kind of means that there's probably a scenario for your preferred version of the future. So, and these can be understood as the official versions of the future from places like the Commission, European Commission, UK Government, Committee on Climate Change, who are the statutory advisors to government, to DEC, Department of Energy and Climate Change, Ofgem, the statutory regulators, Scottish Government have their own scenarios capacity, which is beginning to happen. Scottish Government have just commissioned their own Scottish energy systems model, whole energy systems model. And then there's this much more kind of diverse, multiple world of unofficial futures from all kinds of different bodies, from consultants, industry associations, policy think tanks, environmental groups, consumer groups, even academia, all kind of articulating what is the best version of the future for the energy system. And they have all kinds of different kind of ways of selecting their orientations and favored futures over others. All that list is very familiar to people in the energy world and the STIS world, I guess. And what this reflects is a very fragmented research infrastructure. So the UK has been rebuilding its energy research capacities, but doing it in a very sort of liberalised, post-technocratic way, where there's a lot of different initiatives come forwards every year. We haven't rebuilt a national lab infrastructure. So the US has a very much a kind of central national lab infrastructure for doing energy research, which it's maintained for a long time. We've done it by all kinds of different ventures, both academic and sort of business and public-private. So that's a characteristic way of doing energy research in the UK. I'm not sure it's been consciously adopted, but it reflects the wider kind of funding culture and the research culture. So just to get some things on the table in terms of why scenarios are kind of perhaps valuable, I won't read out the quotes, but just some different ideas about understanding complexity, that we understand, if you manage to get demand reduction right, you don't need to do very much on the supply side as an obvious thing. So we need some way of kind of quantifying this and understanding the balance there. If we can change behavior in a way, we have to do less on kind of technology investment. And we need to systematize that knowledge. And that means a way into efficient and accountable setting of policy priorities. And that's been recognized in a lot of government documentation, and the IEA is the International Energy Agency, who also do global energy scenarios using similar tools and techniques as the UK government. But it's also about sort of making sure I did some work for UKIRK where we were trying to anticipate innovation. So when you're thinking about 40-year timescales, the technologies that are going to be around in 40 years are very likely not to be the ones that are around at the moment in terms of what are the best ways of decarbonising. And how do we anticipate that? It's obviously a very difficult problem to predict with any certainty, but it's still important for those of us who think a lot about innovation dynamics, that we're making decisions in the present day which reflect the possibility of change in the future. So before I get to that, heat has become a really prominent topic in Scottish government thinking and UK government thinking. This problem of heat has appeared, and it sort of came out of nowhere for a lot of people doing energy research, because we spent a lot of time worrying about power, which is the electricity side of the problem, and sort of gas, but we never sort of thought about it as heat. And so it's quite interesting that heat has emerged as the term that's being used to, I had a lot of people telling me earlier today, we need to do something about heat, and what's the heat? How do we understand the heat problem? And probably that wouldn't have been even used as the term. So it tends to be identified as an area where there's been a huge gap in our research and policy efforts. But the reason for that really is because there wasn't a heat problem. We had a very nice, secure supply of fairly kind of, not hugely carbon intensive in the sense that it's been sitting off there in the North Sea as our kind of medium carbon stock of heating 80% of our homes. And that's the real transition of the heat system in the UK has been the story of gas-fired central heating. So the chart at the top left is the transition between 1970 and the mid-2000, 2008, which shows the orange wedge where basically 80% of the homes in the UK are now fed by the gas mains grid, and that's been providing fairly cheap, fairly secure, well, very secure, and fairly, not hugely carbon intensive. If you had to identify the biggest carbon intensive part of the UK energy economy, you've been worried much more about coal-fired generation in industry and in power supply. So, but things have changed. So heat has become a problem in its costs. We've all seen the price of the way we heat our homes kind of double in a fairly short period of time. If you're on the gas contracts, there's no getting away from that. We've started importing a lot more gas as our own North Sea supplies have become exhausted. We're getting a lot of gas from the Norwegian bit of the North Sea, but also increasingly LNG imports on ships from Qatar, which is the green bit. This is the sort of the net trade balance in our gas imports on the lower graph. So there's a security of supply question, which is not an obvious one to resolve. But then there's the carbon question as well. So this kind of set of figures here, which isn't, again, easy to read, is saying that heat is responsible for half our energy use in the UK. So it's a huge fraction of energy used. 80% of that half is for buildings. 3/4 of that is used in domestic buildings. 3/4 of that is for space heating, and the other bits are for cooking and heating water. And 80% of that comes from gas, natural gas. All of which means, when you boil it down, is actually it's about 16% of emissions. So it's not quite the priority it sometimes appears when you start off with a half of all energy used. I mean, if you're interested in decarbonisation problem primarily, this is not the huge kind of dominating bit of the problem it often appears to be to policymakers, but that's just an interesting issue, I think. So what I do in the book chapter, which I obviously don't have time to do now, is go through a whole set of official versions of the future. And these are just some of the documents. These are some of the main ones. And I don't even have time to probably go through all the slides I've got on this today, but these are the various scenarios coming out of Department of Energy and Climate Change and the Committee on Climate Change. So they're the two obvious kind of mainstream official articulators of the energy future in the UK since the Climate Change Act. Now, I will say something about this because Climate Change Act is one policy instrument, but it's only one, and the way it's been responded to in investment and policy has been greatly kind of affected by other things at the European level, which aren't quite as directly understood. So the Climate Change Act is a kind of, we must decarbonize 80% of our energy system by 2050, but then there are other things which are commanding much more kind of shorter term timescales. The Renewables Directive and the Emissions Trading Scheme. And both of those mean that the focus in policy tends to be much more around 2020 than 2050. So, and it's the way they interact together, actually, that is the real key problem. Because the Emissions Trading Scheme, as everybody might know, has been kind of wholly unsuccessful in its direct effect on the carbon price, but it's had a major effect on the way we do our carbon accounting in the UK, in that we distinguish between traded and non-traded parts of the economy in the way we do our carbon budgeting. And yeah, I'm not going to explain that, I don't think, but it just means that some bits of the energy system are much more under the control of UK policymakers, and one of those is heat. So heat becomes a very important part of meeting UK carbon budget targets. There are all kinds of different ways we might be able to decarbonize the heating system. So this is just I've stolen a slide on, again, of technologies involved. The main thing that's really kind of, I think is interesting from a kind of STIS perspective is, and from a kind of social sciences perspective is, the division between community level network solutions, which is really about district heating in the bottom left there, and all these other kind of household level technologies. And they have very different governance implications, of course. So I won't really explain, there's no, that's just technical detail apart from that, actually, for the purposes of a way into this problem. So what I do in the chapter is go through these different policy milestone documents and devise some of the kind of stories that come out of that. And there's a story of kind of continuity and change in different versions of the future. As time is kind of really running out, I think what I'm going to do is just cut to my discussions, make the slides available, so that the details of the story are less important than some of the messages I want to try and communicate, I think, for now. Okay, so apologies, but I'll make these slides available. So, having outlined that story in a very kind of high-level form, the stories that emerge from this really are, I've grouped them together in four different themes. So, one of them is this tension between long-term transitions and short-term exigencies. So what really drives policy is often much more about short-term, even though we have kind of models which are, and versions of the future, we're trying to imagine, in 40 years, how might our energy system look like, and what do we need to meet the Climate Change Act commitments. We've had a huge expansion of effort, and over that time, the anticipated versions of the future have changed really very, very, very substantially in a relatively short time. So this 2008 was the end of 2008, the Climate Change Act came into being, and in that short period since then, we've had all kinds of kind of rethinking our way into the future. The earliest mainstream scenarios had very much a short-term outlook, focused on the next decade. So that is about this interaction of different policy mechanisms. Although we have a declared policy commitment over the next 40 years, 35 years, we have now, in practice, talk to policymakers, they're really worried about how they meet their carbon commitments. Over the next year in Scotland, Scotland's Climate Change Act requires annual reporting to Parliament. In the UK, it's every 5 years at the UK level. So short-termism is a kind of, thinking about the future has been a kind of casualty of endemic short-termism. The early versions of the future, which I haven't really explained, identified a kind of an all-electric version of the energy system. So this means that the way we provide energy services becomes very much kind of based around the electricity system, an expanded electricity system. So everyone will be driving electric vehicles, and everyone will be heating their homes with electric heat pumps by 2050. Plus a electricity system which is kind of carbon-free, essentially. So that was built into the modelling work in the earliest period after the Climate Change Act. This was quite a kind of, obviously a radical, progressive, it's been described as a radical progressive version of the future. It came out of modelling work which was actually rather simple in what it represented. It represented techno-economic knowledge and data. It neglected a lot of social, institutional, and behavioural issues and some other technical issues. So those voices that were not committed to this version of the future soon began to chip away at it, to highlight its weaknesses and erode a kind of sense of faith in it. And that's been the story that's told in the chapter, partly through these marginal scenarios. So organizations which had a stake in the existing system started to commission studies which highlighted the weaknesses of this official version of the future. And then we've seen a moderation of that official version of the future through iteration between the mainstream accounts and the marginal accounts over time. So it's become less technologically radical over time. So there's a question in the paper and in the work about, is this kind of modeling determinism? To what extent do we see modeling determinism? And it's true that in the early period, the rise of this official version of the future based on electricity was very much associated with a particular kind of form of modeling, techno-economic modeling, and particularly one model called the Markov model, which is a linear program, a long-standing kind of piece of modeling architecture in the energy world. And it's very clear that in some of the early work, the idea was that the model set out the optimal future, and policy had to kind of be built around that version of the future. So the idea is that the truth is revealed by the model. The job of policy is to allow that future to be realized, and we all kind of conform around that. That was and it's quite clear in some of the early CCC statements, that's actually almost the language they're using, an optimal path around which policy has to conform. I think it's partly, I haven't got a lot of evidence for this at the moment, but I think there's a question of building up the legitimacy of the radical vision that led to this kind of emphatic statements being made, that somehow we had to say this was an affordable transition, the technologies were available, or they would soon be available, and the costs of transition were, a few percentage of GDP over 40 years at most, and so this was entirely affordable, and we just need to get on with it. This was never accepted by many outside the policy mainstream, but also within the policy mainstream. So we have some interview materials that are used, and there's a senior DEC official who uses the word spurious accuracy about this. He was a dissident voice from within, wasn't listened to for quite a long time. But more broadly, this kind of vision, this all-electric vision, didn't prove itself to be very robust in the face of contested and liberal, diffused political and research cultures. And so we've seen a more recent trend to greater variety, not only in the kind of analytical tools that are being used, but also the evidence bases that are drawn on. And within that, policy has been sort of redefined. So policy is now seen in a lot of the conclusions that come out of the work as the job of policy is to maintain diversity. So we don't actually know the future with confidence. And so given these different options, around different technologies, around building level solutions and network solutions. Policy has to kind of be hedging the bets, and diversity is the watchword rather than optimality. I think there is a lot of interesting work to be done. Some of it has been done on the role of modelling in this area. I think with this pieces of work, so Peter Taylor and colleagues have looked at MARCOL as a boundary object in the UK research and policy communities. I think the work that I've done in this case says, what we find is that models tend to embody the views of particular mainstream organizations at particular times, and that evolves quite quickly in practice. That has proven to be the case here. There hasn't been a rigid kind of fixed position on this. It's also important to say that a lot of the futurology didn't come out of a kind of a black box mysterious modeling process. They were matters of scenario design. So these were upfront decisions by people who were doing the studies that we wanted to build the future around certain perceived priorities. And that's changed from around this big electrification agenda to designing in diversity. And those are decisions that are made before the model gets to work. These are questions of research and policy decisions, upfront decisions. At the same time, we see models giving problems in terms of a false sense of confidence and affordability about the transition question. And that's still, to some extent, around that the UK government sees the energy innovation question as something manageable fairly readily over a short period, and that we will be returning to market competition in energy fairly soon. And there's a lot of evidence to say that this is systematically wrong. This is over-optimistic and simple, partly, I think, from the innovation studies research community. So I think that is one thing we as energy innovation scholars can claim some kind of constructive role in this problem. And the question of research cultures and scenarios representing organizational, institutional interest. Now, this goes back a long way. There's those people who've had their sort of, going back to that quote at the beginning from the CEGB chairman in 1970, and the work of, Stuart Russell wrote about this as the excluding of marginal interests in UK energy strategy with respect to district heating and the way, insider interest, which was reinforced in the legitimate versions of the future, the mainstream versions of the future. I think what we've seen now, some of this, some biases and blind spots in the early work after the Climate Change Act, but what actually has happened since has been much more fluid than we might have expected. And that's partly about what the models are actually saying. So the models identify a huge and important role for demand reduction and behavior change. The cheapest way of changing things in the energy world tends to be around kind of just reducing the need for energy. And that is not well represented in the institutional set of interests in the energy system. So that's quite a radical, disruptive, and progressive version of the future. And in fact, policy has been not able to keep up to that expectation. So some work's been done by colleagues elsewhere from UKIRK who've said, we're going off track on this, that demand reduction measures aren't being sufficiently kind of progressed to accord with what the scenarios say is the best way of getting on with this problem. So I think that suggests a role for scenarios as holding the policymakers' feet to the fire on this, that where we see a lot of supply-side interest dominating energy R&D, we can kind of hold these scenarios up as kind of monitoring and kind of checking devices. And that's been tried. The question of whether that really has impact is another one. But I think what we've seen over time is then a shift from a kind of technocratic core of people doing this work as the community's expanded to much broader kind of constituencies of policymakers and researchers and others. And this has been noticed elsewhere. So there's an American scholar called Anadon who's actually written about the UK system in very positive terms for its flexibility and responsiveness, and compared it to the US system of national labs has been very rigid and built a kind of lock-in effect around energy research in the US because of its national lab infrastructure. So we tend to kind of look at the UK as the problems of fragmentation, but actually there's another interpretation, which is the benefits of having a dispersed system. And that was very manifest in this case. So these counter-narrative scenarios commissioned very consciously by marginal groups were influential, and they've affected the policy mainstream, and they've been an important kind of evidence base for those people within the policy mainstream who've been arguing for alternative, more diverse, less sort of all-electric based futures, and there's a real role there. So finally, we are obviously not in the same world as the technocratic system builders of the past, when there wasn't a capacity to kind of build futures. So we're trying to do this business of whole systems research and scenario making in a very kind of messy post-technocratic kind of context. So how do we reconcile all these diverse policy and research cultures while still taking seriously this problem that Brewer calls developing an evolving appreciation of the whole? That's a really central problem. So there's obviously a danger then of selective references and biases, and I find some of the things that are said about this, that this pluralism and diversity is just something that we should be encouraging, that there is, that top-down versions of the future aren't working. So Andy Sterling, I think, I might be being quite unfair, but from what I understand, Andy's work is suggesting that we should be sort of fostering and kind of turning to pluralism. But at the same time, we have a need for accountable governance, and we also have a need for long-term commitment. So there's no getting away from the fact that if you're going to do massively expensive things like district heating in every UK city, or you're going to do a hydrogen system instead of a natural gas system, these require long-term lock-ins. So this has been, lock-in is a desirable precondition for system change. So what type of lock-in is the real question. I think what becomes more and more evident as you go through this work is that these alternative versions of the future are, in part, instrumental differences between system definition and ordering, but also highly kind of conceptual and normative around what constitutes a kind of legitimate governance issue, what's socially equitable. The whole kind of justice question and the transparency question has become really to the fore, and there's no getting away from the political contestation in this space now, and the energy question. That still begs the problem, or invites work on who's doing the comparison work, who's doing the synthesis work. I found that some of the work that's come forward on this, and there has been more work recently comparing all these different versions of the future, have provided some important spaces for kind of critical reflection on process and the role of people doing futurology in policymaking. So there's some interesting work beginning to appear on that, recognizing the problem is really one of diverse representations, and yet the problem to kind of get on in a very material sense and change the system. So just to finish, we can't avoid saying that whole system scenarios are always going to be limited. There's all kinds of emergent, shifting, contested problems. And so any kind of suggestion of an evidence-based approach leading to an optimal path is a kind of technocratic dream. And I don't think anyone in mainstream policy is really suggesting this anymore. I don't think the CCC are suggesting this anymore. But nevertheless, there is a big tension between a kind of decentered and more kind of diverse future and something which is appearing under the word in the rubric of system integration. So the research councils now are commissioning new work on system integration of the energy system, and that smacks a lot of people as a kind of a return to technocratic thinking, and that just been having a conversation about that this morning, that's causing a bit of concern, that technocentric thinking reappears all the time. It doesn't sort of ever go away. It's a bit like Judy was saying yesterday, the same problems keep returning. But I think, I would just conclude that we have to maintain our efforts to do this work as part of good energy governance, and revealing kind of a more transparent way of deciding about the future. That's it.